Hi, everyone. I am going to give you some information about identity development. And part of this lesson is going to include actually giving information about adolescent identity development. I think it'll make sense as we go along, but I don't want you to be alarmed. I know that you're parenting very young children, but it's something I think important to know and understand and to be prepared for as your kids get older. And so, to begin with, from birth, every child begins the journey of constructing a unique and personal identity. There has been great debate over many, many decades about identity and a person's identity and whether nature is the main force behind our identity formation, meaning genes and hereditary factors, or nurture, which include environmental factors like our childhood experiences, how we were raised, social relationships, and things like that. And the research that is a big part of the nature versus nurture debate has been on twins. And in fact, one of the most famous studies is called the Minnesota Twins Study. There's a story of twins who were separated at birth and discovered later in life they ended up living 40 miles apart, had very, very uncanny and bizarre similarities. They both married women who had the same name. They had a lot of characteristics and crazy coincidences that were really hard to believe since they were raised apart. So that would lead one to believe that nature must have a big part in identity development. On the other hand, in this instance, they also realized that, yes, they did grow up in the same area, were raised by parents who had essentially the same values and sort of cultural background. And we all know, and what also comes out in other twin studies, is that many, many, many sets of twins who are raised in the same household with the same parents turn out to be very, very different. So in the end, what has been agreed upon by most researchers is that it's both nature and nurture, and that parents play a big part in the process. There is a psychologist by the name of Gertie Lensfeldt Mulders from Denmark who says, your identity is fueled by others. She says, all your life you're exposed to situations that strengthen or weaken your natural aptitudes. And that is how our identity develops. And with regard to parents, she says, in the part that we play in the identity development of our children, she said, for an example, so let's say that you're curious by nature, but you have an anxious parent, and because every time you try to do something, your parent says, watch out, or don't do that. And so then your natural curiosity will be weakened by that. So it's just an example of how parents and parenting styles and strategies and responses play a part in the development of a child's identity. Babies and very young children build their sense of being valued and cared for based on our response to their needs. That's that secure attachment. That sense of security and self-worth gives them the foundation they need for healthy and positive self-image and personal identity. The development of our identity is often, and I would say almost always, a lifelong process. And research shows that only 20% of 18-year-olds, which used to be considered adulthood and is legally adulthood, but only 20% of them have a fully developed sense of who they are and where they are going. And I want to give you a little bit of information, and some of this might be, you might remember this from your college psychology classes, but it's Erik Erikson's Stages of Adolescent Identity Development. And I just want to go through these quickly, and it gives a good framework for what you will be experiencing with your kids as they grow. And I'm sure that a lot of this you'll be able to relate it to your own lives. But so the first stage, and these aren't necessarily in this order all the time when it comes to actual human development, but the first stage is called diffusion, and it's where kids are uncertain about or young adults are uncertain about their identity, or they don't care yet. And this diffusion stage, if kids remain in that phase or stage for a long time, it can be bad, because these are the kids who are kind of passive. They go along with whatever is happening, and they're actually more likely to use drugs and alcohol, because they're the kids that, if their friends tell them to jump off a cliff, they'll do it. So we hope that kids move through that phase. There's a stage called foreclosure, and this is when people think that they know who they are already, or without having sort of explored other options, or their options are limited. And I'm very familiar with this stage of development or identity development. I grew up in an area in a farming community, and also it was a very Catholic community. So when I was growing up, and for many generations before mine, actually, the oldest son in a family got the farm. So they knew from the day that boy was born that that was going to be who they were. They were going to be the farmer. In some of those same families, the second son became a priest, or got the chance to become a priest. So both of those might seem like, ooh, you're stuck with this role that you have to play. But the reality is sometimes it was seen as really a lucky thing. First of all, if you're the oldest son, you got the farm. That can be a pretty good deal. And for back in my parents' generation, Pete, the second born son who got to become a priest, was pretty well educated, and that was something, there was actually a huge investment made in them. So that was also in many cases seen as a good thing. So that's foreclosure. In sort of the normal development of identity, the hope is that kids or people will actually move into the next phase, which is moratorium, and this is where they're actively searching for a sense of self, and maybe sometimes referred to as identity crisis. I know that many of us as adults feel like we've probably had multiple identity crises, but this is where the older teens are just trying to figure out who they are and what they're all about. These are photographs, actually, of my daughter, and I know some of you have maybe seen these. She gives her permission for me to share these, but they're great examples of just things that she did during this moratorium stage. Pink hair and tattoo, obviously not things that I was super thrilled about, and I can look back on them now and laugh, but that was definitely her in the moratorium stage. And then ultimately, we're all searching for the achievement stage, where you've found your true sense of self after you've explored a lot of different identity options, and you discover who you really are. So back to those 20% of 18-year-olds who through a lot of research, it was discovered, did achieve the final phase of identity development. And really, more importantly, what came out of the research is when they looked at what did these young adults have in common, this is what they had in common, and this is something for you to really pay attention to. They had a solid base of affection at home. They had considerable freedom to be individuals. There was mutual respect in their families. They were free to disagree with their parents. They were given encouragement to explore options. They had an intellectual maturity and an ability to reason logically. They had an achievement of ethnic identity and a pride in culture, traditions, and race. And they were comfortable with their gender roles and those of others. So here's a little bit about the stage of power and identity, and it comes from a book called Growing Up Again. The author's name is Jean Isley Clark. She's very well known in our world of child development and parent education. She refers to the jobs that kids have during each phase of development. And the job of the 3 to 6 year old, she says, is that they need to establish their identity in relation to other people. They need to expand their imagination and differentiate between reality and fantasy. They need to acquire information about the world, themselves, their bodies, and sex roles. They need to start to practice socially appropriate behavior. And before I get to kind of the helpful parent behaviors in that stage of development, what can you do to support kids during that stage of identity development? I wanted to mention the important aspect of diversity. A lot of those jobs of the kids during this age are them noticing differences, and that can sometimes be uncomfortable for parents. And so you just need to understand that they do notice differences and similarities from a very young age. And they're noticing it even if they're not asking about it or talking about those differences. Sometimes people will say, well, my child doesn't notice skin color or if anybody looks different from them. Fact is, they are noticing it, but they're maybe just not talking about it. But their comparisons, what they're doing is really helping them develop their own identity and how they fit in your family and school and community and the world. So talking about how people are different actually shows them that you respect and value these differences. The idea is the message of different, we're all different and different is great, is what we want children to hear. And they need permission to think about differences in sort of this open forum, so that in a place, sort of a secure place where you feel comfortable fielding those questions. But it's a very important hallmark of kind of the preschool age, is they really do notice differences, and our responses to their questions and their observations is really important. So helpful parent behaviors during this stage, a lot of these parenting responses and a lot of these tips are going to sound very familiar to you because they're helpful in all ages and stages of development, but particularly as your children are developing their sense of personal identity. Provide love, safety, and protection. Empower versus overpower. Support their exploration of things, people, ideas, and feelings. I probably should have really highlighted this one because it is really the most important thing you can do, to just allow them to explore and learn and experience. That is going to help them discover really who they are and in comparison to others. Validate their feelings even when you don't understand them. Support pretend play as a way to learn the differences between real and pretend and different social roles. So they're going to be acting out things that they're exploring and experiencing in the real world. Provide information about their environment and correct misinformation. Give answers to questions. And it is very much okay to say, and especially if it's an awkward question in public, that's a great question. Let's talk about it when we get home. But you want to show them that you value those questions in any way that you can, even if you need to give yourself a little bit of time to answer the questions. When possible, allow them to experience the consequences of their choices and actions, and then respond accurately to their curiosity about the human body. That is the topic of maybe a whole other lesson that hopefully someday we can talk about together, kind of the sexuality, parents as sexuality educators. So, kind of in a nutshell, and I think for some of you this is you've heard this before, but Alison Gopnik, who's a psychologist at the university, I mentioned it in another lesson, out of Berkeley, talks about the two parenting styles, the carpenter and the gardener. And the carpenter thinks that their child can be molded, that if you do just the right thing and get the right skills and read the right books, you're going to be able to create or shape your child into a particular kind of adult, versus the gardener, who's less concerned about controlling who the child will become and instead provides a protected space to explore. This style is all about creating a rich, nurturant, but also variable and diverse and dynamic ecosystem. So that's who you want to be in order to really support your child's personal identity development. Is be a gardener, not a carpenter. Okay, so what about young children? You're in the earlier phases of identity development, or supporting your child's identity development. And so I'm going to talk about, the information I'm going to give you is mostly about kids age 3 to 6. There is this phase or stage of development that is sometimes referred to as the stage of power and identity. And that, I'll get to that a little bit in a minute. But by the age of 3, most children see themselves. This is just some information to let you know about how they see themselves at this young age. Most children see themselves as separate and unique individuals. That's definitely a stage and a phase, an important milestone in cognitive and social development. They define themselves in concrete terms, using physical attributes, names, age, gender, who they're friends with, things they have, and things they can do. So if you ask your kids, who are you? They might say, I can run fast, or I'm 3. And then their self-image tends to be descriptive rather than judgmental, and they are beginning to categorize people. This is important to know, beginning to categorize people just like they are categorizing colors and shapes in terms of, math skills, but categorizing people by their physical characteristics, gender, and by the roles that they have.